This is a loosely coupled show with James Hickey and Comartin. If you're new to this channel, we chat about software architecture and design. Make sure to subscribe to get all our latest episodes. If you have a suggestion for a topic or a guest, make sure to let us know in the comments.
Yeah, I had testing it down as it's a very broad topic. But I mean my ideas around testing are definitely biased because of kind of the kinds of projects that I've been on. For the last 2.5, 3 years, I've been the company I'm working for now. Like basically, when I started with them, they had nothing, like multiple distributed applications and like no deployment pipeline. It was just all like manual FTP up to the server to deploy it, and of course no tests at all. So yeah, it comes around to like architecture too, like how you design your software. That affects whether you can even test at all. You think of like VB, like really old VB applications where you're literally doing like SQL in the UI. That's hard to test. You can't really test it. But even things like web forms, like those older technologies, people tend to write those in a way that's not testable. So yeah, I think the concepts around like splitting concerns up, so keeping your infrastructure concerns separate than, let's say, your domain, your business logic. And it's usually your business logic that you want to test for the most part. Then I guess we can get into that, and how important are integration tests or like even end-to-end tests when you're testing like the entire thing from the UI on. My opinion on end-to-end too is my experience with end-to-end testing is it's really hard to actually execute unless your UI is like really simple. But a lot of the UIs I'm working with are like not deterministic. They're really wonky because it's just like you're dealing with legacy technologies and they've been built in this really weird, strange way, and so you don't have guarantees that like a certain button is going to be available within like a second or whatever. And of course that depends on the speed of your machine and all these kinds of things. I found that using something like Postman, I know you talked about using Postman, you use Postman for like API stuff at least. I found doing that is a good, what's the word? It's not like you're not doing the full end-to-end, but it's good enough, I find.
Yeah, I guess like when you say like end-to-end,
even that's not like end-to-end, but
yeah, like I would generally think of, I guess it depends on even that, what one mean, like when somebody says that, what they mean. So because our clients are so decoupled from our HTTP API, to me, end-to-end is interacting with the HTTP API, not necessarily the client, like using Selenium or any type of UI test runners. Like that's kind of like, that could be included, but it's also potentially separate from that. So yeah, I think you're on to it. It depends a lot. I think not even so much the code you write. Obviously that plays a giant role in things. But when you mentioned like kind of like the app frameworks, if you're using a library or framework that doesn't make it incredibly easy to test, you're kind of like screwed right from the beginning.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're set up just down a road for failure of not being able to test anything if your framework doesn't allow it.
Yep.
Or if you're kind of really going against the grain of what the framework wants you to do to try to get testability, then you're probably doing things that make it a lot more difficult to do other things that the framework makes really like simpler, I guess.
Yeah.
And why it's kind of there. I think that has kind of been figured out in modern libraries and frameworks, but yeah, once you get into that older stuff, which there's a ton of it out there, so when you're jumping into it, how exactly do you, like you kind of mentioned, like how do you go about doing it in an environment where there's nothing there, and the kind of the libraries and frameworks that you're using are really push back against being able to do it to begin with?
Yeah. I mean, the point you raised about like having if your clients are decoupled from your API or your backend, then yeah, the way you design the API is going to be done in such a way that you can test it. But yeah, when you do have coupling to your UI, I think that's where you run into a lot of trouble, because if people are coupling to the client, chances are they're doing other kinds of coupling down lower, like doing database queries where maybe you shouldn't do them because now you can't test, or reading files, things like that. But yeah, I mean, that's just it. Like it really depends on how you've structured things, and like you said, the framework, like .NET Core, for example, they I think it was one of the 2.0 or 2.1, one of those versions, they came out with like integration tests that you can you can like send HTTP requests in memory to your actual web application and test it that way, which is pretty cool. But before then, how do you do it?
So the interesting thing with that, though, is there would be people, including myself, probably. It depends what, I guess, your goal is, but even with like the HTTP test server, or for example, let's say you're running tests that need to hit a database, and let's say you're normally using whatever, some relational database. So you're using SQL Server, Postgres, MySQL, something. But instead, you end up using, say, I don't know, an in-memory database that has a provider that you can use, or maybe it's like SQLite or something that because it's faster, it's in memory, there's no setup teardown, right? And that makes it simple for your tests to run. They run quick, but the reality of it is you're not really hitting the database.
Yeah.
And the database has an incredibly important role, right? And there's likely, just like with HTTP server, there's behavior differences that you're not going to get, right? Like if you're hitting SQLite, and it's obviously not the same thing as Postgres or as MySQL. It's just not the same thing. Yep. Yes, it may cover a lot of situations, and that may be fine for just the general stuff that you're doing, but maybe it's not.
Yeah, I've seen issues with this. There's been some discussions online, I think, in the last few weeks, that I've seen people, I think maybe like Julie Lerman and Jimmy Bogard, some of those people, basically saying that, if you're testing a different kind of database than what you're using in production, then I mean, even if you don't know what the differences are, they're not the same thing. Like,
pretty
just
well.
on principle, you know that they're not the same thing. And then, I mean, that goes back to this issue of like, if your testing environment, the more your testing environment drifts from what your production looks like, then there's more risk or more potential that maybe your test will pass, but the behavior is actually different in your dev environment than in your production environment. So yeah, I mean that.
The one thing
I think that's probably why like containers and are so useful, because you don't have to worry about doing like, oh, okay, well, if I'm in a test, like in your code, if I'm in a test, use this database or whatever, you can just kind of incorporate that into your configuration in a container and not worry about it.
The one thing I think about often, and this is an awesome place to do this because then we can get feedback on what I'm about to say, or the question I'm about to pose is, how many projects that are pretty long-lived, and let's say like not frameworks, not libraries, just business applications, where you have a fairly decent sized test suite. I think there's different reasons why people write tests. I don't think there's, I think there's just different reasons. We won't get into those, but I just think there's different reasons why people would do it.
Yep.
And my curiosity is, how many teams can, if they just are brutally honest, say that their tests are a net positive or net negative? Mm-hmm. The reason I ask this is because, to me, depending on how you're writing tests and how you're writing code, can, in a lot of situations, be a net negative. Because it's not like, if you can write bad code, you can write bad tests. You know what I mean?
Actually, the two usually go hand in hand. Sadly.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. So what I'm curious of is just how many people have been in situations where you're constantly battling tests or fixing tests, a test breaking, and because all that code, and depending how your tests are written, how much they understand the internals of what you're testing, to me they can be a net negative.
Yeah, and this is one of the, I don't want to say attributes or traits, but I've noticed that like throughout time. I think I actually tweeted about this last week, or this week, maybe. Anyways, there's, when I think back to like the programmers that I've worked with in my career that I would consider, quote, good programmers, as a really bad, very ambiguous term, good.
Yeah.
Maybe professional, skilled. Let's say like maybe competent. Competent would be a better word. One of the big things is like those people understood how to test their code.
Correct.
And I remember like the first company I worked with, actually the first couple of companies I worked with, I never was taught about unit testing, any kind of testing. It was all done by like a QA team that manually tested everything, which is probably typical of like an enterprise organization. I remember like the first time one of these developers was building like this important piece, and he did it, like he created his own project, he put tests around it, and it was funny because there was another guy on the team who this guy would just go in to other people's code. Maybe he was fixing a bug or maybe whatever, and he had the knack of like rewriting people's code. Like even if it worked, he just doesn't like the way it is. He would go in and like rewrite it. But anyways, he'd keep doing that and breaking the tests. So this guy like all the time was like, "You broke my test. It doesn't work anymore. Go fix it." Like, so it was neat because this guy would be like, "I don't care. Go fix it. Like, you broke it. Go fix it." That's just like a funny story that for myself, but because of this guy has just had the knack of changing other people's code. So like this is probably not why you want to test, to like defend against people who keep changing your code, but
I mean, to be clear too, I'm not advocating not testing because I know that's immediately what people are going to think I just said, and that is not the case. And I think there's something to be said too for, as in regular code, it's almost like people don't separate that like writing tests is still writing code. So it's what I was.
It's a liability.
It could be.
If you had, like you said, if you have bad, poorly written tests, what I see a lot of time is people writing tests that don't actually test anything.
Potentially, or not like the right thing.
Well, that's it. They like test things, but or it's either that or it's like you're testing too much. Like there's a lot of issues
Yeah.
like that.
Well, I think the thing too, just I get to kind of round up what I guess the point I'm trying to make is, I think just as in how you generally write software, you will generally learn how to write better tests. And maybe the exercise always, which it has been for me always, has been just like code. It's the same for tests. Is as with experience of doing it, you get better at doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But the caveat being, early on, I think you'll probably do it terribly, and it will be at that moment potentially a net negative, where you're just not doing. You'll see that you're not doing it. Potentially, again, it depends what the reason is why you're doing it. If you're doing it for regression, that's to me very different than. It's a different reason than if you're doing it for correctness as you're developing. I think they're different things. I think you can write them in a very similar way, but I think they're different things. I think they're different goals.
Yeah, and that I'll just we'll probably end it soon here, but yeah, my thought when I brought wanted to talk about this was really when I'm testing the way I usually architect things or design things is I think we talked about this before. It's similar. So you get a request from the UI. That is probably going to trigger some kind of command, and that command is going to kind of penetrate into your domain layer. So you have a command, and your command maybe orchestrates a few things. Maybe get some data from the database, passes that to some kind of domain object or whatever. And then once that processing is done, you put that result back in the database. That's kind of your typical scenario. So I have kind of two different kinds of tests that I like to do. One is the command itself. And in some cases, when you actually have like a sequence where as a user, there's actually like this sequence where typically I will issue this command and then I will have a choice between two other things I can do. So what I like to do is actually test those kinds of scenarios, but they're not like really specific tests. They're more generally like say they're smoke tests, because they are heavier because you have to start mocking stuff, which is, I think that's we won't get into that, but it is heavy. It's a lot more work to have to start mocking like database calls. So I mean, for those kinds of things, I like to do that test where I'm just testing a scenario and then mocking stuff. But because of the mocking, right, it's hard to mock every kind of scenario. You have to, the code you have to write, it becomes really kind of cumbersome. But I at least like to do like smoke tests, and here are kind of the most common cases, and I'll do that. And then the other kind of tests I like, which is definitely where I like to be more specific. I'll have very specific tests, and I'll write a lot of them. And I will try to cover as many of the like different kinds of scenarios is testing the actual domain objects, which I'll design in a way that they don't have any dependency on like a repository or the file system or whatever. I'll try to design them in a way that it just accepts like a plain data into it. And that's kind of the job of the command handler, is to fetch that data and then pass it on to those objects. So I like those two kinds of tests. I find they complement each other well. And what I find is if I don't have one, then I feel like I'm missing, because you can have all those really specific tests, but then like that orchestration, something might fail there or whatever. But yeah, I mean, do you have any ideas or thoughts?
No, it sounds very familiar.
Okay.
That's pretty much it. The only thing extra to that is when you're seeing kind of that handler code get a little gnarly, and that's to me where the idea of having a pipeline really comes in, to have that request go through a pipeline that then different concerns are separated into different handlers and are just calling one after the other. and that just kind of helps with responsibilities of what the actual handler needs to do. Because if you see a lot of dependencies in it, because you need to do a lot of things beforehand, actually, before you actually call into a domain or whatever you need to do, usually an indication, I guess, that it probably needs to be split up a little bit more. But yeah, everything what you said is up my alley.
Cool. Well, I guess we'll end it on that note.
So test and fail miserably doing it and learn from it and keep going.
Yep.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Loosely Coupled Show. If you did, please subscribe for more on software architecture and design.